All right, everybody. Welcome back to Politically Plain. I'm gonna do something a little bit different today. My sister actually started reading this book, and I actually read this book in college. It's a great book. Highly recommend reading it. But it's One Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse. And so I'm gonna start doing these little videos on chapter by chapter explanation from my point of view. And this is actually my second take, because the first take I think I wasn't a big fan of. And so regardless, we're going to start in chapter 1 of this book. The chapter 1 is called The New Forms of Control. And so I think for the first minute, 2 to 3, 4 minutes of these videos I do, I'm going to kind of just give a full brief explanation of the chapter, and then I'll kind of go into the details. Go into the chapter a little more, and I'll read some quotes from the book. Just as background, so Herbert Marcuse, I think he was born in the late 1800s and lived through, of course, World War I and II. He would be deemed a critical theorist, and that's kind of his background in a nutshell, super basic. And of course, one of the books he wrote was One Dimensional Man. So for those of you who aren't familiar with critical theory, I would say critical theory is literally just the examination and study of how institutions and various economies, governments, how they interact and affect people and the way they live, and their various forms of control and power, and how they, again, affect us. So part of critical theory is this idea that critical thinking is important, really, and critical thinking being, the ability to take a system or a power system or really any system and examine its various parts and how they are affecting people, humans, and society. So whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. The critical thinking part is, okay, how is the system working? How is it not working? And how can we fix it? So that's really what critical thinking is. So chapter 1, the new forms of control. This chapter is pretty much a solid introduction into his whole philosophy and idea behind the title, One Dimensional Man, One Dimensional Society. And that idea that he brings up is essentially that we as the system we've created, being this capitalist system, has reduced our individuality and reduced our critical thinking capabilities. And it does that through a couple different ways that he talks about in the new forms of control. And one of those ways being, creating this, I'm going to switch, creating this idea of false needs, creating greater depths of alienation. These false needs are essentially, they're fulfilled through consumerism, and he argues technology is a way that these false needs are reinforced. And then, of course, as we consume these false needs are, we feel fulfilled in filling these false needs through consumerism. And he argues that this kind of alienates us from our true selves, from each other, from others around us. And so the new forms of control, the title, he argues that this is just a way for the system to control us as humans, a way for us to be controlled and manipulated so that we don't critically think about the system. And this chapter, he really doesn't go into, the negatives of the system, I'd say. He's essentially just setting the stage for why is this society one-dimensional? Why is he arguing that we're a one-dimensional people? And again, specifically the one-dimensional, if I had quotes on here, he means one-dimensional in the sense that we are all the same. We're all chasing the same false needs. We're all chasing the same way of life. He argues that we are... everybody's chasing the same job, or not even the same job, but, money in order to fulfill these false needs. Everyone wants the newest and latest gadgets and phones and computers and toys, cars, homes, whatever. We're all chasing that same thing. And so that's the way that the system controls us, is by, using technology, the media, and using advertisements and whatnot to push these various false needs. So anyways, that's kind of chapter 1 wrapped up. Again, I like to say it sets the stage for the rest of the book. And I think it does it pretty well. For anyone who's read Marcuse and any critical theory literature, you know how difficult it is to read. For anyone attempting to read it, I would be really surprised if you read through chapter 1 and were like, oh yeah, like that made total sense. Or if I wouldn't be surprised if you get through a couple pages of chapter 1, you're like, yeah, I'm not reading this. So let's go ahead and get into it a little more in the weeds. And again, I'm gonna try to let Marcuse speak, and I'll just try to break it down as best I can. I remember when I first read this in college, I felt like I felt inadequate, I guess is a good way to put it. Like, I just could not comprehend the words that I was reading. And luckily I had a really, really good professor who was able to dumb it down for me, and I was able to understand a lot more. And as I studied it, he had a suggestion that what you should do is try to skim it, go back, and then read it line by line and really try to figure out what he's talking about in each little paragraph. So regardless, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about, the first thing we should talk about is critical thinking. This is a major point of critical theory, obviously, but also of the whole book. One of his main arguments is that critical thinking is something that the system doesn't want, or doesn't see as valuable, I think is a good way to put it. And this one-dimensional way of thinking, wanting the same things as everyone else, reduces critical thinking, because critical thinking is about going against the status quo, going against what is happening around and trying to think like, okay, why aren't we doing things a different way? Like, why wouldn't we, you could think of any problem that's going on today and say like, okay, well, why is that happening? Is the system perpetuating a certain way that actually doesn't help us? That's critical thinking, is the ability to remove yourself from the status quo and what everybody else is doing and think critically about the system that's in place. So I'll read this first quote, and this is kind of about why he believes critical thinking is important. So he says, and he's actually talking about past forms of societies. He says, the rights and liberties which were such vital factors in the origins and earlier stages of industrial society yield to a higher stage of this society. They are losing their traditional rationale and content. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and conscience were, just as free enterprise, which they serve to promote and protect, essentially critical ideas, designed to replace an obsolescent material and intellectual culture by a more productive and rational one. Once institutionalized, these rights and liberties shared the fate of the society of which they had become an integral part. The achievement cancels the premises. So what he's talking about is, he's essentially saying that where we are now, if you were to try to break down the society we live in now, and specifically in the United States, he says it, like freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, free enterprise. Those were at one point critical ideas that were against the status quo of a previous culture. So if we were to go back to what the world was before capitalism, or the system we're in, a capitalist system, and we were to propose capitalism in a theoretical way, everyone would say you're crazy. Like, oh, that's so crazy. Like, why would we do this? Like, the current way works. Some people might even say like, oh, actually, that's a great idea. But, you'd probably get a lot of like different views on that idea. And that's a critical idea, because it may fix a lot of the things that are going on. And that's what he's saying, is that those ideas were meant to replace a previous society and culture that then became obsolete, right? And so that's what he's talking about with of why critical thinking is so important. And so that's actually like one of the very first things he says in the whole chapter. So let's move on to the false needs. So as I kind of talked about it, these false needs he describes are needs that aren't true needs. So in true needs, he describes are just like food, water, shelter. And I think he also mentions clothing as a true need. And so he says that the current system perpetuates false needs in order to control you, to control what you consume, and to essentially keep you busy on consuming these false needs, always chasing the newest thing. I guess just think about it like if Apple only released one iPhone ever, and they just, came out with updates that updated the same iPhone, well, nobody would ever be chasing the new iPhone because it doesn't exist. There would only be one iPhone. So he argues that, through advertisements, media, technology, the system provides these, he actually calls them wasteful. And he specifically says, like, turning this waste being these false needs, gadgets, into an idea that you actually do need them. You're turning waste into something that's not waste, or is, hypothetically in our culture is seen as not waste. So this is what he says about that. False needs are those which are superimposed upon the individual by particular social interests in his repression. The needs which perpetuate toil, aggressiveness, misery, and injustice. Their satisfaction might be most gratifying to the individual, but this happiness is not a condition which has to be maintained and protected if it serves to arrest the development of the ability to recognize the disease of the whole and grasp the chances of curing the disease. The result then is euphoria and unhappiness. Most of the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and consume in accordance with the advertisements, to love and hate what others love and hate, belong to this category of false needs. Such needs have a societal content and function which are determined by external powers over which the individual has no control. The development and satisfaction of these needs is heteronymous. No matter how much such needs may have become the individual's own, reproduced and fortified by the conditions of his existence. No matter how much he identifies himself with them and finds himself in their satisfaction, they continue to be what they were from the beginning, products of a society whose dominant interest demands repression. Okay, again, big words, but I mean, again, what he's saying is these false needs are those which are superimposed upon the individual by social interests. And what's meant by that is they're advertised and told to you. So you are told what you should be getting, what you should be buying, and it's against what you actually truly need. And so, and he also acknowledges like the satisfaction of these false needs is probably, it probably brings like a lot of satisfaction as you consume them. And he acknowledges like a lot of individuals actually probably claim like, oh, I actually do want these, like these are wants and needs that I genuinely want. But he's saying and arguing like, the only reason you feel that is because the society and media and, maybe corporations through advertisements and technology have told you over and over and over again that this is what you want. And it makes it worse that, not only is it just telling you, but it's telling everybody. And so when everybody starts buying it, you then align with what everybody else is doing. He's probably, Marcuse is on the boat that I think, and I'm putting words in his mouth maybe, but Marcuse is on the boat that humans are social creatures and humans like to follow along with what the group's doing. And that's part of, that gets, I would say, exponentially worse as our critical thinking and individuality goes down, because as this is decreased and as everybody begins buying and trying to chase the same thing, you're going to just continue to do what everybody else is doing. And if everybody's doing it, you're just going to pull people, as people join the society, are being born and are raised in that society, you're just going to reinforce this loop of chase the same thing, buy the same things. And, that's kind of what he's arguing with this whole thing. And in this little snippet is, I like this part. No matter how much such needs have become the individual's own, reproduced and fortified by the conditions of existence, they continue to be what they were from the beginning, products of a society whose dominant interest demands repression. And again, super basically, what he says there is, no matter how much people say that these needs are their own needs, so no matter how much people say, no, these really are my needs, I do need this, regardless of that, they will remain, those needs will remain what they were from the beginning. And that is simply products of a society whose interest, the society's interest, is to repress and to keep you in control, doing what everybody else is doing. And again, being a one-dimensional person. So that's that. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's go to my next one. Whoa. Let's see. This next one I have let's see if I want to read this one, actually. Oh, yeah, this is a good one. So this one kind of goes along with the other, but it'll tie in well to kind of what we go into next. But this is talking about rationality, and I'll kind of keep this one relatively brief. So again, here he's talking about rationality and irrationality. And again, the wording is kind of tough to follow, but we'll try to, I'm going to kind of bounce between this. So this is on page 9, if you have this book, on the right side. It says, we are again confronted with one of the most vexing aspects of advanced industrial civilization, the rational character of its irrationality, its productivity and efficiency, its capacity to increase and spread comforts, to turn waste into need, and destruction into construction. The extent to which this civilization transformed the object world into an extension of the man's mind and body makes the very notion of alienation questionable. The people recognize themselves in their commodities. They find their soul in their automobile. They find their soul in their hi-fi set. They find their soul in the split-level home, in their kitchen equipment. The very mechanism which ties the individual to a society has changed, and social control is anchored in the new needs which it has produced. So again, kind of what I was talking about before. What he's saying is, I kind of like to think of this quote as he's giving props to capitalism in the society we live. He's saying that the way that we're living now, capitalism itself and civilization, advanced industrial civilization, is incredibly productive and efficient. Incredibly productive and efficient. But with that kind of comes obviously a caveat and kind of a danger, right? And what he says about this is that it has a rational character, but it's an irrational rational character. And so what he means by this is the system that we live in can create need out of waste. Take these wasteful things that we don't need and make it a need that people want. It can take destruction into construction. So what he means is we can destroy things, destroy nature, destroy, the human mind, and out of destroying nature, construct something out of it. Whether it could be literal, like we could literally construct infrastructure, buildings, gadgets. Well, how do you start by constructing these things? Well, you have to destroy something, right? And, on the surface, again, what he's saying is, well, this is clearly, I should say, really at a deep level, it's irrational. Because it's like, well, why would we want to create a need out of waste, right? Why would we want to destroy in order to create? And that's what he's saying, that civilization transforms the object world into an extension of the man's mind and body. So what he's saying with this part is, he brings up the notion of alienation. He's saying that the extent to which civilization can transform the object world into an extension of man's mind and body makes the very notion of alienation questionable. So let's touch on alienation right now. So alienation is essentially, if I had to put it super simple, it's just a feeling of isolation, really, being removed from something and being, feeling like you're, again, I like to say isolation is probably a good synonym for alienation. You're being isolated, you're being removed. You have this feeling of like, you're disconnected would be another good synonym. A feeling of disconnection. That's alienation. And what a lot of previous, again, this is where it kind of gets hard because you do have to understand some previous philosophical comments on alienation. So just to bring up like Marx, for example, alienation is talked about in previous philosophies, that alienation occurs when you're laboring and when you're creating gadgets. You're alienating yourself from yourself because you're doing something that you really don't want to do. You're just doing it to make money. And so that alienates you from what you truly want as a human. And I know if that sounds kind of hard to understand, just understand that a lot of previous philosophers philosophies will say alienation just occurs when you're doing something that society is telling you to do, but deep down in your psyche, you actually don't want to do as a human. And so that alienates yourself because you feel disconnected from what you're doing. So imagine I told you, like, someone is forcing you to do something and it's like a 9-hour work session and they're like, you have to do this. Regardless of if you want to do it, you're being forced to do it. Well, you're going to feel alienated because you're going to be like, well, I don't even want to do this. So as you're doing it, you can just imagine like a feeling of disconnection, like, well, this is not, I don't want to say weird, but it's like, I don't even like doing this work. I don't even like doing what I'm being forced to do, but I have to do it because he's paying me or whatever it is. And so you'll have a feeling of disconnect. So anyways, that's just a quick analogy for that. But let's get back to Marcuse because he actually makes a different argument. What he says is right here, when civilization can transform this, and transform these objects that it creates and make them so that they're an extension of man's mind and body, it makes that notion questionable. So what he's saying is, if this system can create these objects, gadgets, whatever it is, software, computers, to the point where it feels like, yeah, I actually do like doing this, and it's an extension of my mind and body in this object, well, then alienation becomes a weird thing, because it's like, well, now you may not feel alienated anymore. You may actually feel like, no, I actually do want these needs because I feel like this is part of me. I've put my heart and soul into making this for this person or whatever, for this company, whatever it is, or doing this service. This is a part of me. And so he says this is where alienation becomes questionable, because the people recognize themselves in their commodities. They find their souls in their vehicles, their split-level homes. And that's where he then says the very mechanism that ties this individual to society has changed. And now social control is anchored in the new needs which it has produced. So he's saying it's now beyond, it's almost a new form of control where people have begun to see themselves in these commodities. And so now everything technology and this new industrial society produces, these false needs, actually creates more control. Because now that people see themselves and want them, they feel them as more of a need now than ever, it actually is a greater form of control. And so that's what he's saying in that section. And just to touch back on rationality, what he's trying to connect is that whole process is rational to somebody just on the outside looking in. If you're on the inside if you're on the inside of the society and you're looking at this, you're going to say, well, this is rational. Technology produces things I think are neat, and it does it really well. It turns waste into something I supposedly need. And so that's very rational. But what he's saying is the contradiction, the paradox is that if you're on the outside looking in, it's actually irrational, because the technology is creating it as a way to control your mind and your consuming habits. And that's irrational. Why would you want something to create things that you don't need, that are wasteful, and just have it convince you that it is a need for you to follow along with whatever the system wants? That's irrational. So that's his point. So, okay, I think that's pretty straightforward, and hopefully I explained that decent enough. So let's go into the alienation a little bit now. I think I already touched on it, so as I read this, if I feel like I did a good job of explaining it, then we'll skip it. But this is on page 11 of this book. And he says, I have just suggested that the concept of alienation seems to become questionable when the individuals identify themselves with the existence which is imposed upon them and have it in their own development and satisfaction. This identification is not illusion but reality. However, the reality constitutes a more progressive stage of alienation. The latter has become entirely objective. The subject, which is alienated, is swallowed up by its alienated existence. There is only one dimension, and it is everywhere and in all forms. The achievements of progress defy ideological indictment as well as justifications. Before their tribunal, the false consciousness of their rationality becomes the true consciousness. Again, I think I'll just only add that what he now argues for here is that because alienation becomes questionable, he argues that this alienation that we see is actually a more progressive state of alienation. And this progressive state, this very progressive stage of alienation, is essentially we are swallowed up by the alienation. So no longer can we even feel the alienation occurring. Now we're just swallowed up by it whole, and it becomes objective to the point where it's one-dimensional altogether. There is no critical thinking ability or individuality, because he essentially argues that before we could actually acknowledge it, we could acknowledge when we were working or having a feeling of we're slaving away, and you could feel that actual disconnect between you as a human at home and you working, or you as a laborer and the true you. You couldn't quite grasp it. But now he's saying this new form of control, this new alienation, this progressive stage has swallowed us up to the point where we can barely even recognize the alienation. And he's saying this false consciousness of feeling like you see yourselves in your commodities, that false consciousness has become the true consciousness. And so that's what he talks about with alienation. Let's now get into the last quote, and this is actually on the third to last page. He did kind of touch on, actually this will be a good tie, he touches on progress in that last one a little bit. And this one really talks about progress as well, and technology. So, the last quote I want to go over, and this is on the third to last page, page 16. What he says is, and I quote, "Progress is not a neutral term. It moves toward specific ends, and these ends are defined by the possibilities of ameliorating the human condition. Advanced industrial society is approaching the stage where continued progress would demand the radical subversion of the prevailing direction and organization of progress. This stage would be reached when material production, including the necessary services, becomes automated to the extent that all vital needs can be satisfied, while necessary labor time is reduced to marginal time. From this point on, technical progress would transcend the realm of necessity, where it served as the instrument of domination and exploitation, which thereby limited its rationality. Technology would become subject to the free play of faculties in the struggle for the pacification of nature and society." So what he's talking about here is he's alluding to a society where technology could actually, it would transcend what's happening now to the point where technology would actually be able to provide all of the necessary needs, like the actual genuine necessary needs, the true needs for everybody. And I think he kind of foresees a system where automation takes hold in technology, where necessary labor time is actually reduced. And so then this whole idea of, controlling through consumerism and even labor is going to be changed. And he does say in here that he foresees a world, and I think he's trying to say, like, technology could easily be used to provide for all of the genuine true needs for all people. The problem that he sees is it's been essentially hijacked. Media and advertisements and technology overall has been hijacked so that it's controlling, and it controls and tells us what we want. So with that being said, he talks about how before it had been the instrument of domination and exploitation. And what he means is, up to this point, technology has been used to dominate human nature, to dominate humans, and to exploit humans for, both their labor and their consuming, to control them, to control us, to tell us what we want, and to ensure we do what the system wants to do. And so, but again, I think he does argue that technology, well, he does argue that technology could be used to create a world which all true needs are provided for, and it has the capability of doing that. So that is the end of that chapter. With that, again, I like to say there's a lot in here. There's maybe one more thing we could touch on that I think was really interesting. He talks about freedoms, and really he's kind of talking about, like, are we truly free? When people, you'll hear people say, like, yeah, we're in a free country, it's very free. He talks about that, and he essentially argues, like, to argue and to bring up the notion that we are free is kind of, essentially what he's saying is, if you really to think that we're free, you would first have to define what you mean by free. And second, if you were to define it as he would define it, he would say, you're lacking the critical thinking ability. And we really aren't as free as you're saying, because you're locked in this system. And I don't think he would blame you, and I definitely wouldn't blame you. But essentially what he says here is, and I'll just read this as well really quick, is he's talking about these new modes and of freedom. And so he says, such new modes can be indicated only in negative terms because they would amount to the negation of the prevailing modes. Thus, economic freedom would mean freedom from the economy, from being controlled by economic forces and relationships, freedom from the daily struggle for existence, freedom from earning a living. Political freedom would mean liberation of the individuals from politics, over which they have no effective control. Similarly, intellectual freedom would mean the restoration of individual thought, now absorbed by mass communication and indoctrination. Abolition of public opinion together with its makers. And so what he's saying is, if you really think we're free, you would have to almost explain, like, okay, if we have political freedom, why do we have little to no control over the political processes? If we really are intellectually free, why are we so reliant, and why are so many people quick to jump to what the public opinion is? If public opinion is this, everyone jumps to that. And if it's not that, everyone jumps to the next public opinion. If we really are economically free, why do we have no control over the economy? Why we have no control, we have to earn a living. Are you truly free if you're forced to earn a living? One thing we would talk about is, you have the freedom to starve, right? And that's something, I think it was Marcuse that talks about it, but it might have been Marx. Regardless, you can tell me. But is that really freedom if you're free to starve? if you're forced to earn a living, if you're forced to deal with everyday struggles of existence, are you truly free? So you'd have to define it in a different way. You would have to avoid freedom itself. And that's kind of what he's talking about is, we market this system as being the absolute free system or the most free system, but it's not the most free, right? And he's just simply arguing, if you critically think about it, it's really not that free. And again, I want to say, for those who may read this and are like, oh, this is so anti-capitalism. Okay. Well, one, that's the point. And if you don't like it, I would point you to the critical thinking being decreased and the lack of critical thinking. I would just say we should be critically thinking about everything, regardless of how great it might be. If something was so great, critical thinking, you could still have critical thinking, and it would be less critical of the thing that you're critically thinking about, right? And so I would just challenge, if anyone who starts reading this or listens to this and is like, oh, this is just anti-capitalism crap. It's not anti-capitalism. And in fact, again, Marcuse gives a lot of credit to capitalism for being productive and efficient. He just thinks it's being used the wrong way. It's not that he's anti-capitalist, it's that he's anti things that capitalism produces that are bad to the human, to the individual. And why wouldn't you be? Why would you be in favor of something that hurts the individual and, it hurts individuality and hurts society? That's his point, and that's what he is critically thinking about. Like, how is this system affecting people? That's critical theory. How can we fix the system or utilize the system to be better? And again, he acknowledges that. And he even acknowledges that with the whole freedom thing and the rationality thing. This can be a rational system. It can be a free system, but the way it's being utilized by technology, media, and whatnot, it's not as efficient and productive as it could be. And so, and again, that's just critical thinking, right? Critical thinking isn't looking at something and saying how bad it is. It's looking at it and saying, okay, like, what's working, what is not working. And that's kind of this goal. And again, one of his conclusions happens to be like, this is a new form of control. This system, how we have it now, is creating a one-dimensional society, a one-dimensional man where we all think the same. We're all chasing the same dreams. And he sees that as bad, as against individuality. People aren't doing what they may actually really want to do. And if they really want to do something, why should they be punished for doing it if it doesn't make them the most money, if it doesn't get them the falsity that everybody else wants, And I think that's kind of his point, and that's the stage he presents in chapter 1, is that. So hopefully that explains chapter 1 decently well. I did this in 40 minutes. That's actually pretty good. I might be able to cut it down to 30. So thank you for listening. If you're listening on the podcast, thank you for watching. If you're on YouTube, hopefully by next week or within 2 weeks, I can read through chapter 2. And chapter 2 is a good size one. So it may be a week or two before I get through chapter 2 and get all my notes down and do the second video, but thanks for following along. Good luck reading this. Let me know if you have questions. Put your thoughts. Actually, I'd love for people to comment their thoughts on chapter 1 if they've read chapter 1 and what their thoughts are. Could be very different from mine. You're probably more right than me, not gonna lie. So thank you for watching. Have a great day.